Welcome to the Dating After Divorce podcast. I'm your host, Shade Curry, and I believe every divorced woman deserves a romantic relationship where she feels safe, loved, and cherished. You can create the most amazing life after divorce, and I will teach you how. Hello, ladies. Welcome to episode 9. Today, we're going to talk about post-divorce trauma. Now, this discussion about trauma is one that I end up having with every single one of my clients, no matter what their background is. And of course, there are varying degrees of trauma. Some of my clients come from really healthy childhoods where the parents loved each other and they didn't get divorced, and they didn't have childhood trauma in the way that maybe someone like myself experienced it because I had divorced parents or other things that have happened to others of my clients who've experienced maybe sexual assault or things like that. But everyone has painful memories, and they're painful memories to varying degrees. Even when I was a general life coach, I was working with just anyone who came who wanted help with their careers or wanted help with their weight loss. I would always have a conversation with them about the source of some of their most painful thoughts and some of the source of some of their most painful memories. Trauma, and I'm going to put that in quotes, is something that impacts everyone. But there's a special kind of trauma that impacts women who have gone through divorce. And then there's a level of trauma if you were married to someone who was narcissistic or who was abusive, if there was domestic violence in the home or other kinds of really toxic abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse can also have just as debilitating an effect on an individual as physical abuse. So, in this episode, I really just want to start the conversation about trauma. There's no way I'm going to be able to go in depth or even give you everything you need to heal from trauma on this podcast today. Like, it's such a big conversation and it's such an individual experience. Like, everyone's experience of trauma or past pain is so individual. Like, you can't compare one person's trauma to another. However, we can have a conversation that lets everyone know that, hey, you're not alone. You are not the only one who is going through this. There is nothing wrong with you. And I want to start there because one of the things that I see with my clients is often they are experiencing the results of trauma. They're experiencing the the effects of trauma. They're experiencing things within themselves, in their thoughts and in their emotions, and even in their physical body that come from the impact of having experienced childhood trauma or having experienced abuse in their marriage. But then they think there's something wrong with them. And this is such a terrible, terrible impact of abuse. It's like you've been through all of this, and then on top of that, you're convinced that your anger or your pain or your sadness, your grief, your fear is somehow your fault. And not understanding that your trauma is separate from you, that you are not your trauma, creates this situation where I find my clients um, feeling these negative effects, but then also blaming themselves. So they continue to hurt themselves with their negative self talk. They continue to hurt themselves with their personal judgment, blaming themselves for perhaps having emotional flashbacks or experiencing paralyzing anxiety when they're at work, or for having anger because of everything that's happened to them, and that anger comes out in ways that's not productive, right? But instead of realizing that, oh, I'm acting just a little crazy because I've experienced all of this, and if I work through it, I will be better, I will feel better, right? And then I can respond better. Instead of realizing that that's the way out, many people think that there's something wrong with them. So really, that's my purpose today, is to introduce the topic of trauma, where it comes from, how it happens, some of the effects that you might be experiencing if you have this, and really some ways you can start to think about it differently so that you can start to come out of it. When I became a life coach, my first certification was actually in trauma recovery coaching. And I went that route because that was the first layer of healing that I had to go through after my divorce. So if you've listened to my earlier episode about my divorce story, you'll know that I was married for 17 years. And at some point during that marriage, my now ex husband had a diagnosis of bipolar. I don't know if I mentioned that in that episode or not, but I'm mentioning it now. And that really brought understanding of, okay, this is why our family is so sick. This is why we have all of these problems going on. And that issue created a lot of psychological abuse, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of lying and hiding within the marriage. Now, of course, for a long time, I didn't know that this was the case. And even after the diagnosis, I didn't know the impact of this on me. I was not aware of how much of an impact this was having on me. I wasn't aware of how much of the impact of an impact it was having on my children at the time. So, if you haven't listened to that episode, go ahead and listen to the full story there. But I just want to talk about kind of like how trauma happens, and I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of someone who experienced both childhood dysfunction as well as a dysfunctional marriage, and kind of some of the things you might be experiencing now that you're divorced and you're like figuring out, okay, how do I get my life together? How do I grow? How do I enter into a more healthy romantic relationship going forward? So, um, let's look at childhood dysfunction. So, you have a child who's born into a family where they experience abuse. Like you pick your flavor of of abuse, or even if it's just emotional neglect, right? Which is a form of abuse, right? It's not an arrestable abuse, and it's not necessarily that the parents are being malicious or trying to hurt their child, right? A lot of this trauma gets passed down just from habits and from family systems that you learn from your parents, and then your kids learn from you, and it just gets passed down through the years, and people just keep doing things the same way until there's an education that comes in and says, hey, you can do something different, right? If you want to, you can change this cycle. So if a child experiences the abuse or rejection in their family system, they start to equate being mistreated with love, because a child requires its parents, it requires its caregivers, even if they're not parents, to quote unquote love them. Otherwise, they won't survive. This is just how the human brain works. The way the human brain works in children is that it connects love with its caregiver. So, whatever its caregiver does gets defined as love, right? And so when the caregiver feeds the child and hugs the child and, cuddles the child, it's like, oh yeah, this is love. But also when the caregiver rejects the child, yells, screams, comes home drunk, hurts the child in some way, criticizes the child, all the things that can happen in those situations, the child says, oh, okay, this must also be love, right? So it in the brain just is collecting data in the world. So the child's brain is collecting data, and when bad things happen, right, even if the young person logically knows that, okay, this is bad, subconsciously they're like, oh, well, but it must be good because it's happening. Maybe I'm the one who's bad. So they shut down the feelings that they have about the bad things that are happening, right? And then they take the blame on themselves. Some children will create, actually all children will create like transactional behaviors, ways of interacting with the world to mitigate the hurt that comes from the abuse or the trauma that they're experiencing. And if you're familiar with our trauma responses, you have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. These are all ways of coping with bad things that happen in the world. So some children will escape, flight. They might escape into drugs, or they might escape into other relationships. They might escape into books or video games, or not that any of these things, not that video games or books in and of themselves are bad, but I know as a young child I read books 24/7. In fact, my greatest fear was like being caught somewhere and not having a book to read. So I know I definitely use books as an escape, which was, I guess you could say it's a healthy escape, maybe, if any kind of escape is healthy, right? Um, so flight creates behavior patterns of escape because that child's personality just wants to escape from whatever is happening and they pick something to escape into. Fight is the young person who decides that, okay, I'm just gonna fix this. I'm just gonna go out there, I'm gonna, engage with this thing that is wrong and fix it that way. And so you might find someone who is more, who prefers to engage in conflict, who you have the child who is constantly angry, constantly saying things to the family members. Often in dysfunctional families, this person gets labeled the scapegoat, they get labeled the trouble child, they get labeled the problem child, and the dysfunctional family actually arranges itself so that that person gets blamed for everything that happens. So, this might be the flavor of dysfunction that some of you have experienced. Freeze is paralysis, where you find someone who cannot defend themselves. They just freeze. When someone says something to them, they can't talk back, they can't defend themselves, they don't know what to do. They come back 2 weeks later with what they should have said. Maybe they ruminate and think about things over and over and over again. There's a lot of over analysis and overthinking that happens. And then fawn is the people pleaser. So I have a little bit of a flavor of this, which is you try to make friends with the person who's hurting you in hopes that they will not hurt you anymore. So you see this in people who are conflict avoidant, have poor boundaries, can't say no, always say yes in hopes that they won't get into any kind of a problem with the person that's hurting them. So these are four ways that a child might grow up developing behavior patterns to deal with what it thinks is the whole world, right? So at that time, I guess you could say ages 0 to maybe between 8 and 12, the child is forming these behavior patterns and ways of engaging the world based on the dysfunction that it's experiencing in its family. However, the rest of the world isn't that way. Right? Some of the world is, but not the whole world. And these are certainly not healthy ways of responding because a child was never really meant to grow up in an environment where it was in like on a battlefield, right? And I know some of you will relate to the feeling of growing up in a home that felt like a battlefield, or growing up in a home where you had to walk on eggshells, right? Growing up in a home where you didn't get your needs met, where there was no love, there was no affection, where there was abuse, where bad things did happen. No child was meant to grow up in that kind of an environment. And no child really has a choice in the dysfunctional patterns that they develop trying to survive in that environment. So then what happens is this child grows up, has these behavior patterns, they're all solid. Well, the child goes into the world thinking, okay, love hurts, love is hard, right? Like I gotta fight my way into a relationship. I have to be passive in a relationship for the relationship to work, or I have to people please for relationships to work. All of these thoughts that have been pre-programmed, and this child goes into the world and meets a partner, right? Now, if they meet another partner who is not healthy, and of course, unhealthy is a spectrum, there are varying degrees of unhealthy. I'm not going to try to create one scenario here. So please do not take anything I say here as being, okay, this is a diagnosis of anything for anyone. I'm really talking in general terms about what the possibilities are. Um, if a child meets a partner who is unhealthy, and unhealthy could be anything from a codependent partner to an abusive partner to someone who has a mental illness to someone who is, just manipulative or exploitative. There's just so many, there's so many possibilities here. That child will potentially be attracted to that because it feels so familiar. It feels like, oh, this is how I grew up, right? But this is not a conscious attraction. And if you listen to my story earlier, I was not consciously attracted to my ex. The attraction when I look at it now was subconscious because it just felt like home. It felt like the home I grew up in. It felt like the people I was accustomed to, right? And so the repetition compulsion kicks in where even though you're not trying to recreate your childhood home, Somehow you do, because you have the behavior patterns that just fit right into the dynamic of having an unhealthy relationship. So for many divorced women, this was the case where you just found yourself somehow, even as you were actively trying to create a better relationship, you found yourself creating one that was exactly like your parents' relationship, or a flavor of it, or a version of it. Sometimes the gender roles get reversed, where maybe your mother was the one who was narcissistic or who had an illness. And then you marry a man who is like your mother. So it really can go so many different ways because it's just so personal, right? And then you go into that marriage, and then probably for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you're just repeating this dance over and over and over again, where, you're experiencing hurts, you're shutting down your feelings just like you did when you were a kid, you're blaming yourself for the problem, or if you are a people pleaser, you go into fix it mode and you try to control the world and you try to fix things for everybody. You try to make everything great, or you try to keep up this image for the world. So many different ways of responding to this situation. And as that time is passing, I think this is where people miss it. We think we're staying the same, right? You think, well, I went into this relationship as a good person with good responses. What you may not realize is that as the dance of death is happening in your marriage over and over, where someone is gaslighting you, hurting you, where toxic interactions are happening on a daily basis, maybe multiple times a day. What you may not realize is that you are changing also, right? You're developing, either solidifying your toxic patterns or your thoughts that are not healthy or your emotions that are not healthy. You're changing and growing in one direction or another. And so by the time you get a divorce, many women are very angry, right? And sometimes this can really hurt you in the divorce process, because then the whole world looks at you like, oh my God, she's so angry. Like, oh my God, like she was telling me about her relationship, and I can't imagine, being married to her because she just sounds terrible. Well, it's not because you're a terrible person. It's because you've bottled up this anger for so long and not processed it and not dealt with it, right? Or the grief, right? You might have had grief from childhood trauma that maybe went unprocessed, and then now you have the grief that comes with getting divorced and all the losses that go with that. And that, it's like you have this backpack of emotional baggage and emotional stress that you've been carrying around for so long, and the divorce comes on top of it, and it's like, just it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the backpack of emotional baggage just splits open and everything spills everywhere. Right. I know that was my experience, was that my emotions during the divorce were just like, whoa, all of them, all the emotions, all the pain, all the anger, all the frustration. And still at this time, I was also experiencing the actual process of having to go through the divorce court to do all these things, moving out of my home, taking care of the kids, having no income, like all the things were happening. But then emotionally, I was also dealing with everything that was coming up from like my entire life, right? And so that is just kind of like, in a really, really tiny nutshell, what post divorce trauma can look like, what it could feel like.
Do you wonder exactly how divorced women just like you are meeting eligible men who want a real relationship and a commitment? They're doing it by dating with their core values. Your core values are the GPS that lead you to the partner you've been looking for. When you use your core values on dating apps, text messages, and at social events, you will easily connect with your true match partner without chasing, settling, or wasting time with non-committal men. I have taught exactly how to do this in the 2-hour Core Values Dating Blueprint course available on my website, shadecurry.com/dating. That's SADECURRY.com/dating. You will learn exactly how to identify your core values and use them on your dating profile, how to ask the right questions via text, and how to tell the right stories on dates, so that you attract the right people and repel those who aren't right for you. If you're ready to meet your true match, hop over to shadecurry.com/dating or click the link in the show notes. Now back to the episode.
So now, say your divorce is over, you now want to create a new and healthy relationship, right? And many people are often frustrated because, their friends tell them, well, you'll just find another person, right? You'll just find another person. They'll forget him. You'll just get someone else. And then when you step out to date, you're like, what's happening? Why can't I find someone better? Why can't I find someone good? Why is it that all the people around me are just narcissistic jerks who just want one thing? Why is it that there are no nice men in my environment? Why can't I find a good guy? Well, the reason potentially is that you still haven't healed your repetition compulsion. Now, this is not to say that there are no unfit people on dating apps or in dating circles, right? There are unfit people everywhere in the world. I've talked about this before. Like, many of us met our exes at church, right? Many of us were introduced to our exes by good people, and they turned out to not be good people. So it's not about the dating apps are bad. It's about healing your ability to see good people in the world, right? By healing the emotional imprint that you've been carrying either from childhood or from your first marriage, right? So if you've experienced kind of the type of trauma I'm talking about, it's likely that the people who have done the most painful things to you in your life are the people who were the closest to you. They are the people who were supposed to love you. They were supposed to think you were precious and treat you as a precious person. They were supposed to love you, but they were the ones who said the harshest things and the worst things and created the most painful situations for you. That does not go without an impact. You can't experience that and feel like, oh well, that didn't have an impact on me. And I was that way for many, many years. I really thought my childhood had no impact on me. I thought that I was good because my life was better than the life that my parents had, right? My marriage, even my first marriage, was better than my parents' marriage. That's just really sad, right? So I thought that I was good. I thought that I had figured it out, right? But I hadn't, as evidenced by 17 years later. All of the poop hit the fan. So someone has said that, we repeat what we don't repair. And I think that that's true. That's the concept of repetition compulsion is if you don't heal and process what's happened to you in your past, if you don't heal those emotions, if you don't develop new more healthy patterns of thinking, you are very likely, and this is not 100%, many people, go on to just, they know what they're doing. Somehow their brains are wired to like figure this stuff out without any help, without coaching or therapy, and they figure it out and they do it. I have definitely seen a couple of people who have done that. However, I think for most people, if you don't have that kind of clarity right out of the gate, you will repeat what you don't repair, right? Our trauma responses will create patterns of behavior that we carry out into the world and into our relationships. We carry them out into the workplace, right? So, for one, you might not have the ability to have a healthy interdependence with other people where you can ask for help from safe people, right? And receive help without feeling obligated to give other people your firstborn child, right? So that's like the people pleaser, one of the people pleasers types of responses. You might have shame spirals if you were shamed as a child, right? You might have really intense feelings of shame coming up for you in certain situations, which can leave you open to manipulation. Because if you are hiding from the emotion of shame, and an exploitative person notices that, they can use shaming you to get you to do what they want. And you do not want to carry that out into the dating world, not at all, because people will try to shame you. I remember I had certain boundaries that I would put in place on a first date. I would, if a date was put on the books, I would tell the gentleman, hey, I would prefer no physical contact other than holding my hand if you would like on a first date. So I'm like, I don't know this person, right? And some of the people that I met would try to shame me because of it. Like, well, what do you mean? And that's not okay. And why would you do that? And I had no because I had walked through my healing, I didn't think twice about it. I was like, hey, maybe this isn't a good fit. It's okay. This is cool. But yeah, we're not going to be hugging or whatever on our first date, which was my personal preference. So because I had healed shame in that respect, I was able to put healthy boundaries in place according to my preferences. So, if you have shame spirals or emotional flashbacks, panic attacks, it can really hinder your ability to function post divorce at the level that you want to, right? The whole idea of being divorced is that you can have the life that you want, right? You don't have to wait for someone who doesn't have a growth mindset to finally come to their senses before having an amazing life. Like if you are divorced, you have a whole opportunity to rewrite your story, to create a whole new story. But it's really hard if you've got some of these things going on. So I really want you to think about what are some things, impacts or emotional baggage, whatever word you want to use for it, trauma, behavior responses, patterns, difficult emotions that I am carrying that could potentially have come from my childhood or could have come from what I experienced in my marriage. And just self reflect on whether it's a possibility that you could run faster and achieve more and enjoy life more if you worked through healing those experiences. All right, so I'm going to run through just a list of certain markers that could give you an indicator about whether or not you are still experiencing painful emotions from your childhood or painful emotions from your marriage. And just to give you an idea of like, it's such a wide range. Psychologists have coined a word that sort of encompasses the impact that this can have. They call it complex PTSD. So it's not quite the same as PTSD that the veterans experience, but what happened was they started noticing that people who went through chronic stress in their lives, like we've talked about in their marriages, in their childhoods, in work environments, were showing some symptoms that were similar to regular PTSD. And so they just coined the word complex PTSD for like this bucket, like this bucket of like, painful emotions and painful behaviors that people had. And they've used that word to explore it. So I want to just say, hey, if you could be experiencing complex PTSD, it's not an official diagnosis in the medical field. It's just I guess, a label that can be helpful in describing what's going on. And I've listed just a few of the symptoms that you might be experiencing or things you might be experiencing in your life that could indicate that maybe you do need to talk to someone about the possibility that these are affecting your life. So, anxiety, being easily triggered, feeling unsafe in the world, feeling like you cannot create a sense of safety or security, an excessive need to be understood by others, excessive guilt, where you feel guilty about everything, not able to create a vision for your life, having a poor sense of self or personal identity, poor emotional boundaries where everything that people say impacts you. Also, poor physical boundaries where you feel the need to give other people everything that they want from you. You could potentially be tolerating toxic people. Um, Indulging in like self betrayal or self abandonment in your relationships where it's all about the other person, but you can't seem to take up any space in your relationships. Being addicted to certain people in your life where you just feel so needy about that person and you can't bring yourself to do without having that person in your life. Like you might get enmeshed in your relationships. Hypervigilance, where you always feel like something's going to go wrong, a fear of conflict, anger, having strong emotions, potentially overreacting to things, self doubt, indecision, like chronic indecision is one that I have seen in some of my clients, self hate, self blame, a really harsh inner voice where you really beat yourself up over things that you do or don't do, wanting to fix others, wanting to control others to feel safe, taking excessive responsibility for other people, learned helplessness, which means just that feeling of, I don't know what to do next, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to do that, feeling like you cannot be an adult in your life, like you cannot self-govern and you need to like ask everyone for advice before you can take one decision. And even then, you still overthink the decision. Fear of failure, fear of being wrong, a really, really low self esteem. You might have difficulty regulating your emotions or choosing the emotions that you want to have in your life. Like that's what we talked about, the extreme anger. You might grieve like really, really deeply and not be able to get out of the grief. You might lose memories. Like I know I experienced like serious memory loss like in my 30s. Like it was like I was a senior. And after I walked through healing and getting healthy again, like all of that loss of memory or like not remembering things, walking into a room and forgetting why I came, all of that disappeared when I worked through my own symptoms and impact of trauma. You might feel detached from yourself. You might feel numb, like unable to feel anything. See, that's like the other side of the spectrum where you're so detached from yourself and from your emotions that you don't feel anything. For sure, all of these will culminate in having difficulty in relationships, right? Difficulty trusting others, difficulty trusting good people, or even a tendency to trust people that are not trustworthy. Like it is so crazy how these symptoms, from a logical perspective, you'd be like, well, why would I do that? It's because it's a trauma response. It's something that needs to be processed, needs to be worked through. So that kind of opens the conversation about trauma. I don't want to get way too specific on any one of the symptoms today, but I really just wanted to open up that conversation. And if any of this resonated with you, I want to invite you to join me on a webinar on March 17th, 2021. So that's tomorrow. I'm publishing this on the 16th of March. If you are listening to this before or on that date, you're welcome to join me for a webinar about how the 7 things you need to heal after divorce so that you can attract a healthy and loving partner. And a lot of that conversation is going to be about some of these symptoms and how they hold you back and how they're impacting your dating journey after divorce. So I want to have that conversation with you. If you go to my website, shadicurry.com. You can sign up for the webinar there, or if you're on my email list, you will get the Zoom link tomorrow. Or you can just go to Instagram, at Shadicurry, SADECURRY. There is no H in my name. And in my link tree, you will find the link to sign up for the webinar. I would love, love, love to see you there and continue this conversation about healing after divorce. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening today. If you are ready to get married after divorce, I want to invite you to download my free 8-video training specifically designed to help divorced women date with ease and get married again. Head over to shadicurry.com to get started. That's SADECURRY.com. I'll see you inside.